Nobody paid attention to the small coffee shop owner until a retired Navy officer noticed how he stood, how he scanned the room, how his eyes tracked movement like he was still on watch. That's when he saw it, barely visible under the apron strings. A small pin that meant everything to those who knew what to look for. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden service and quiet dedication, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who found new ways to serve. Harborview Coffee sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, squeezed between a used bookstore and a dry cleaner. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Faded blue awning, hand-painted sign, and windows that had seen better decades. But inside it was something special. Not because of the decor, which was simple and clean, or the menu, which offered honest coffee without fancy names. It was special because of the man behind the counter. David Santos had owned Harborview for 12 years, 54 years old, average height, with graying hair always neat despite the early mornings. He wore the same uniform every day, dark jeans, white button-down shirt, and a navy blue apron that had his name embroidered in simple block letters. Nothing flashy, nothing that drew attention, just a man making coffee and serving his community. David knew every regular by name and order. Mrs. Patterson got her medium dark roast with cream at 6:45 a.m. sharp, always asking about his weekend plans. Tommy, the construction foreman, needed his large black coffee and a chocolate donut by 7:15 or his crew would know about it. Sarah, the nurse heading off her night shift, got a double-shot latte and a quiet smile that said thank you for keeping people safe. What the customers didn't notice was how David positioned himself behind the counter, always at an angle where he could see both the front door and the back exit. How his eyes swept the shop regularly, not looking for spills or empty tables, but scanning faces, noting who belonged and who didn't. How he kept his back to the wall and never turned completely away from the room, even when operating the espresso machine. David moved with an efficiency that seemed natural but wasn't quite normal. He could prepare 3 orders simultaneously while carrying on conversations, keep track of inventory without writing anything down, and handle difficult customers with a calm authority that made even the most aggressive personalities settle down without understanding why. The coffee shop opened at 6 a.m. every day except Sunday. David was always there by 5:30, going through a routine that looked like simple opening procedures but was actually something else entirely. He checked every lock, every window, every exit. He tested the phone lines and made sure his cell phone was fully charged. He positioned supplies strategically, not just for efficiency, but for quick access in case of emergency. Commander William Bill Hayes, U.S. Navy retired, had been coming to Harborview Coffee for 3 weeks. He'd moved to town after 32 years of service, looking for quiet and good coffee to start his retirement mornings. The shop was convenient, the coffee was excellent, and the owner seemed like a decent man who minded his own business. But Bill Hayes hadn't gotten to Commander by being unobservant. Something about David Santos felt familiar in a way that had nothing to do with small-town friendliness. It was the way David moved, controlled, purposeful, never wasted motion, never turned his back on a room full of people, always positioned where he could respond to threats that probably weren't coming but might be. Bill had seen that bearing before, in briefing rooms and on ship decks, in men who'd been trained to stay alive in places where staying alive required constant vigilance. Then there was the way David handled stress. During the morning rush, when orders were backing up and the espresso machine was acting up and 3 customers were complaining about the wait, David never lost his composure. His voice stayed level, his movement stayed precise, and he managed the chaos with the kind of calm authority that came from managing much worse chaos in much more dangerous places. Bill started paying closer attention. David's haircut was civilian now, but it had military precision. His posture was relaxed but ready. His eyes were friendly but alert. And when he spoke to customers, especially the younger ones, there was something in his voice that reminded Bill of senior NCOs, patient, authoritative, protective. One morning, while waiting for his coffee, Bill noticed David reach under the counter for something. Just a glimpse, but Bill's trained eye caught it. David was wearing a small pin on the inside of his apron, positioned where only he would normally see it. The pin was small, silver, and shaped in a way that made Bill's breath catch. A seal trident. Bill had seen thousands of them over his career, worn by some of the most elite warriors he'd ever known. But this one was different. It wasn't the standard issue pin. It was smaller, more discreet, the kind given for specific operations that didn't make it into official records. That afternoon, Bill went home and spent 3 hours on his computer, cross-referencing databases he still had access to and making calls to contacts who might remember a David Santos from the teams. What he found made him understand why a man who could have had any job in the private security world was instead making lattes for construction workers and nurses in a small-town coffee shop. The next morning, Bill arrived at his usual time, but lingered longer than normal. He ordered his black coffee, took his usual seat by the window, and waited for the morning rush to die down. When the shop finally emptied, except for one customer reading a newspaper in the corner, Bill approached the counter. "David," he said quietly, "I was wondering if you had a minute to talk." David looked up from cleaning the espresso machine, his expression polite but cautious. "Sure, Commander, what can I do for you?" Bill paused. It wasn't something you could tell just by looking at a retired officer in civilian clothes. "How did you know I was a commander?" David's hand stilled on the machine for just a moment. "You carry yourself like one. 30+ years, I'd guess. Probably surface warfare, maybe some joint operations experience. And you know this how?" David met his eyes directly. "Same way you've been watching me for 3 weeks trying to figure out where you've seen my type before." Bill smiled slightly. "Fair enough." He leaned closer to the counter. "I couldn't help but notice the pin inside your apron yesterday. That's not standard Navy issue." David's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He reached into his apron and pulled out the small pin, placing it on the counter between them. It was indeed a seal trident, but smaller and more intricate than the usual ones. Engraved around the edge in letters so small they were barely visible were coordinates and a date. 32 Degrun N 44 Degrun E 503. Bill stared at the pin. He knew those coordinates. Iraq 2003. One of the most classified operations of the early war period. Task Force Black, Bill said softly. David nodded once. "Among other things, you were part of the Al-Qaeda leadership removal operations." "I was part of keeping people safe," David said, picking up the pin and putting it back inside his apron. "Same as I do now, just different methods." Bill looked around the quiet coffee shop, the clean tables, the comfortable chairs, the regular customers who trusted this place to start their days right. "Why here? Why this?" David followed his gaze. "You see Mrs. Patterson over there? She lost her son in Afghanistan. Comes in here every morning, and for 20 minutes she has someone to talk to who understands what service means. Tommy, the construction guy, he's a veteran too, Desert Storm. Never talks about it, but he doesn't have to. And Sarah, the night shift nurse. She's taking care of people the same way we used to, just in a hospital instead of a hot zone." David began wiping down the counter with the same methodical precision he probably once used to clean his weapons. "This community has people who served, people who sacrifice, people who protect others. They come here because it feels safe, because something about this place feels secure. They don't know why, but they feel it. And you provide that security. I provide good coffee and a place where people can start their day knowing someone's watching out for them. It's not complicated, Commander. It's just service." Over the following weeks, Bill became more than just a customer. He and David developed the kind of friendship that forms between men who've seen similar things in different places. They didn't talk much about their service. Men like them rarely needed to, but they understood each other in ways that civilian friendships couldn't match. Bill learned that David had served 15 years with Naval Special Warfare, including multiple deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and places that didn't appear on his official record. He'd been part of direct action teams, hostage rescue operations, and counter-terrorism missions that had saved countless lives. When he retired, he could have taken any number of high-paying private security jobs. Instead, he'd used his savings to buy a small coffee shop in a town where he'd never been stationed, where no one knew his name or his history. He'd chosen to serve in a different way. "Don't you miss it?" Bill asked one quiet morning when they were alone in the shop. "The action, the mission, the brotherhood." David was restocking supplies behind the counter, every movement economical and purposeful. "I miss parts of it. The clarity of the mission, knowing exactly what you're supposed to do and why. The trust, knowing the guy next to you would die before letting you down." He paused, looking around the shop. "But this isn't that different. These people trust me to be here, to provide something they need. Mrs. Patterson trusts me to listen when she needs to talk about her son. Tommy trusts me to have his coffee ready so his crew doesn't have to wait. Sarah trusts me to be awake and alert when she's been up all night saving lives. And you trust them. I trust them to be good people who deserve a safe place to start their day. That's enough." David finished restocking and moved to check the front door locks, a habit Bill had noticed he performed multiple times per day. "The mission isn't that different, Commander. We're still protecting people. We're still making sure the community is secure. We're still serving something bigger than ourselves. The tools are different, but the commitment is the same." 3 months after Bill and David had first talked, that commitment was tested. It was a busy Friday morning when the man walked in. He was young, maybe late 20s, wearing a heavy coat despite the warm weather, and his eyes moved constantly around the shop in a way that had nothing to do with choosing what to order. He got in line behind the usual morning customers, but he wasn't looking at the menu board or checking his phone like everyone else. He was mapping the room. David noticed immediately. His body language didn't change. He continued taking orders and making drinks with the same friendly efficiency, but Bill, who had learned to read the subtle signs, saw the shift. David's movements became slightly more deliberate. His positioning behind the counter adjusted to provide better lines of sight, and his interaction with customers took on the controlled calm of someone managing a situation. The man ordered a black coffee and paid in cash, but he didn't leave after receiving his order. Instead, he took a seat near the back corner, positioned where he could see everyone in the shop, but where his back was protected by the wall. Classic tactical positioning. Bill felt his own training kick in. He'd been about to leave, but instead he returned to his table by the window and ordered another coffee. Without discussing it or even making eye contact, both veterans had decided to wait and see what developed. For 20 minutes the man sat without drinking his coffee, just watching customers come and go, watching David work, watching the patterns of the shop. When Mrs. Patterson came in for her usual order, the man's attention focused on her, the way she interacted with David, the obvious affection and trust in their relationship, her routine and timing. David served Mrs. Patterson with his usual warmth, but Bill noticed he positioned himself between her and the watching man, and when she left, he made sure to watch through the window until she was safely in her car and driving away. That's when the man got up and approached the counter. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying an undertone that made Bill's hand instinctively move toward where he used to carry his sidearm. "I was wondering if you could help me with something." David looked up from the espresso machine, his expression polite but alert. "What can I do for you? I'm looking for someone. A man who might come in here regularly. Older lady, drives a blue Honda, comes in every morning around the same time." Bill felt his blood pressure spike. The man was asking about Mrs. Patterson, and there was no innocent reason for a stranger to be tracking her movements. David's demeanor didn't change, but his voice carried a new quality, still professional but with an edge that suggested the conversation could go in directions the stranger might not like. "I serve a lot of people coffee. Don't really keep track of their personal details. But you know who I'm talking about. I've been watching for a few days. You two seem close, like maybe you know where she lives, what her routine is." David set down the cloth he'd been using to clean and looked at the man directly. "I think you might be in the wrong place, friend. This is a coffee shop. We serve coffee. If you're looking for someone specific, maybe try the police station down the street." The man's expression hardened. "I don't think the police would be much help with this particular situation, but you might be exactly the right person to talk to about my problem." That's when Bill stood up. He didn't move toward the counter, didn't make any aggressive gestures, just stood and let his presence be known. The man glanced at him, then back at David, and suddenly seemed to realize he wasn't dealing with just a small-town coffee shop owner. David stepped slightly to one side, a movement that looked casual but gave him a clearer path around the counter. "I think we're done here. You can finish your coffee, or you can leave, but this conversation is over." The man looked between David and Bill, processing the changed dynamic. Whatever he'd been planning, he was now facing two men who clearly weren't going to be intimidated or manipulated. "Maybe I'll come back when you're not so busy," the man said finally. "Maybe you won't," David replied quietly. The man left his full coffee cup on the table and walked out. David immediately moved to the window and watched until the man got into a car and drove away, noting the license plate number on a piece of paper. After the man left, David locked the front door and turned the sign to closed, despite it being the middle of the morning rush. He pulled out his cell phone and made 2 calls. The first was short and quiet, just a license plate number and a description. The second was to Mrs. Patterson. "Helen, it's David from the coffee shop. I need you to do me a favor and not come in for your usual coffee for the next few days. I'll explain later, but right now I need you to stay home and keep your doors locked." Bill had heard enough conversations like this during his service to know that David wasn't just calling the local police. The first call had gone to someone with resources and databases that could track a license plate through systems most people didn't know existed. "How long before you know who he is?" Bill asked. "Couple hours, maybe less." David was checking his phone for return messages. "But I already know enough. Professional surveillance, tactical positioning, asking specific questions about a vulnerable target. This isn't random. What do you think he wanted with Mrs. Patterson? Nothing good. Could be related to her son's service. Could be financial. Military families are sometimes targeted for scams or worse. Could be completely unrelated to the military angle." David paused, thinking. But the way he positioned himself, the way he watched the patterns here, that's not amateur hour. David's phone buzzed. He read the message, his expression darkening. Rental car, fake ID, paid with cash, but the cellular data shows he's been in the area for a week, and he's been to Mrs. Patterson's neighborhood multiple times. Bill felt the familiar surge of protective anger he'd experienced during his service years. What do? We make sure she stays safe while people who are better equipped than local police handle the larger problem. David was moving around the shop now, not frantically but with purpose, checking locks, adjusting his position to maintain sight lines to the street, and we stay ready in case he decides to come back and try a different approach. "You think he will? Men like that don't give up easy. He's been planning something involving Mrs. Patterson, and today didn't go the way he expected. He's going to reassess and try again." David's phone rang. The conversation was brief, mostly David listening and asking short questions. When he hung up, he looked satisfied but still alert. "That was faster than I expected. Our friend has been running the same scam in 3 other states.
targets military families, particularly widowed mothers, gains their trust through elaborate stories, then cleans out their savings and disappears. He's wanted by federal authorities in connection with elder fraud and identity theft. They're going to pick him up. They're going to try, but these guys are mobile and they're smart about staying ahead of local law enforcement. The good news is, Mrs. Patterson is safe now that we know what he's after. The bad news is, he might try to target other military families in the area before he moves on. David looked around his coffee shop, the empty tables, the locked door, the peaceful space that had suddenly become part of something much more serious. The mission just got a little more complicated. What happened over the next 3 days reminded Bill why he'd always respected Naval Special Warfare operators. David didn't just wait for federal authorities to handle the problem. He activated a network that Bill hadn't known existed in their small town. It turned out that David's customer base included more veterans than Bill had realized. Tommy, the construction foreman, had served 3 tours as a combat engineer. Sarah, the night nurse, had been an army medic. The quiet man who came in every Tuesday for a decaf latte had been a marine intelligence specialist. The woman who owned the bookstore next door had served as a Navy communications officer. David contacted each of them discreetly, not asking for help, but sharing information. Within 24 hours, they had a communication network that would have impressed any military intelligence unit. Every military family in the area was quietly warned about the potential threat. Local businesses frequented by veterans were alerted to watch for suspicious activity. An informal patrol system developed, with people checking on each other and reporting anything unusual. The man never came back to the coffee shop, but he was spotted twice more in town. Both times he found himself being observed by people who knew how to observe without being detected, and both times he left the area quickly. On the 3rd day, he was arrested 50 miles away while attempting to approach another military widow. Mrs. Patterson never knew how close she'd come to being victimized, but she noticed that David seemed extra attentive during her morning visits, and that several other regular customers had started greeting her more warmly than usual. She attributed it to the general friendliness of small-town life. A week after the incident, Bill and David were alone in the coffee shop during the quiet mid-morning lull. The normal rhythm of the business had returned, but both men understood that something fundamental had changed. "That network you activated," Bill said. "How long have you been building it?" "Since I opened the shop. Not intentionally at first. I just noticed how many veterans lived in the area, how many people had served in different capacities. Started paying attention to who they were, what their skills were, how they might fit together if the community ever needed protection." David was organizing supplies behind the counter, but his movements were relaxed now, without the controlled tension of the previous week. It wasn't about planning for trouble. It was about understanding the resources available if trouble found us anyway. "And when trouble did find you, when trouble found Mrs. Patterson," David corrected. "She's part of this community. Protecting her was protecting all of us." Bill thought about his own transition to civilian life, how difficult it had been to find purpose without a clear mission and defined objectives. "Is this what you meant about service being the same, just with different tools?" "Exactly. In the teams we had intelligence networks, communication systems, rapid response capabilities, and a clear chain of command. Here we have people who care about each other, businesses that support military families, informal communication through daily interactions, and the understanding that we look out for our own." David paused in his organizing. "The mission parameters are different. We're not hunting high-value targets or conducting direct action operations, but the core mission is the same: protect the community, neutralize threats, make sure good people can live their lives safely, and the coffee shop. The coffee shop is the perfect cover," David said with a slight smile. "Central location, regular contact with community members, natural gathering place for information sharing, and completely invisible to people who think veterans can't do anything more complicated than pour coffee." Bill laughed. "I have to admit, when I first started coming here, I thought you were just a guy who made good coffee and minded his own business. I do make good coffee, and I do mind my own business, but my business includes making sure this community stays safe." David looked around the shop with obvious satisfaction. Some people might think it's a step down from counter-terrorism operations, but protecting Mrs. Patterson from a scam artist, making sure Tommy has his coffee so his construction crew stays on schedule, being here when Sarah needs someone to talk to after a hard night at the hospital, that's not less important than what we used to do. It's different, but it's not less. Different theater, same war. Different theater, same commitment to service. 6 months later, Harbour View Coffee had become something more than just a neighborhood coffee shop. It was still that. Mrs. Patterson still came in every morning. Tommy still needed his large black coffee. Sarah still got her post-shift latte. But it was also something that didn't have a name or an official structure. It was a place where veterans could find other veterans without having to announce their service. where military families knew they had people watching out for them, where young people could learn from older ones about what service actually meant, where a community had quietly organized itself around the principle that those who had served continued to serve, just in different ways. David never advertised his background, never put up military memorabilia, or wore service-related clothing. The small seal trident pin stayed inside his apron, visible only to him. But somehow, word got around. Not gossip or stories, just the quiet understanding that the man behind the counter had earned the trust he was given. New customers began to include more veterans, drawn by recommendations from friends who said the coffee was good, and the owner got it. Active duty personnel from the nearby base started stopping by when they were in town. Military families chose Harbour View for birthday parties and casual meetings, knowing their children were safe and their conversations were understood. Bill had become a regular fixture, arriving early most mornings to help with the opening routine and staying late some evenings to help with closing. He'd found his own way to continue serving, using his administrative skills to help David manage the business aspects of the shop, while providing the kind of leadership and mentorship that made the informal veteran network more effective. One morning, a young Marine recently returned from deployment came in looking lost and overwhelmed. He ordered coffee and sat alone, the 1,000-yard stare visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Without discussion or dramatic intervention, the shop's regulars simply made room for him. Mrs. Patterson asked if he'd like to join her at her table. Tommy offered him a job with his construction crew. Sarah mentioned that the hospital was hiring security guards if he was interested in steady work. David served his coffee and quietly placed a business card for veteran services next to his cup, along with his own phone number written on a napkin. No lecture, no forced conversation, just resources and an open door. The Marine came back the next day, and the day after that. Within a month he was working construction with Tommy, had enrolled in night classes, and was part of the informal network that looked out for other veterans and military families in the community. David Santos still owns Harbour View Coffee, still opens at 6 a.m, still knows every regular customer by name and order, still provides the best coffee in town with the kind of service that makes people feel valued and protected. But the mission has expanded. The coffee shop has become a model for how veterans can continue to serve their communities in civilian roles. Military families from surrounding towns drive extra miles to do business with someone who understands their sacrifices. Young veterans find mentorship and opportunities through connections made over morning coffee. The informal network that developed around Harbour View has quietly prevented 3 other attempts to victimize military families in the area. They've helped a dozen young veterans find jobs and housing. They've provided support for families dealing with deployment stress, injury recovery, and transition challenges.
David never talks about his SEAL background with customers. The pin stays inside his apron, a private reminder of who he was and who he still is. But his service speaks in other ways, in the safety that military families feel in his shop, in the trust that allows strangers to become community members, in the quiet competence that makes complex problems seem manageable. Commander Hayes still comes in every morning at the same time. He's become David's unofficial second-in-command, helping to coordinate the network activities and providing the kind of strategic thinking that turns good intentions into effective action. Their friendship is built on shared understanding. Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform, it just takes different forms. When people ask David why he chose to open a coffee shop instead of pursuing more lucrative opportunities in private security or consulting, he gives them the same answer he gave Bill that first day they talked. I provide good coffee and a place where people can start their day knowing someone's watching out for them. But the real answer is deeper than that. David Santos learned during 15 years with Naval Special Warfare that the most important missions aren't always the most visible ones. Sometimes protecting your community means conducting high-risk operations in hostile territory. Sometimes it means making sure Mrs. Patterson has someone to talk to about her son, and that Tommy's construction crew gets their coffee on time, and that young veterans know they're not alone. The tools are different. The uniform is different, the recognition is different, but the mission protecting those who can't protect themselves, serving something bigger than yourself, being the quiet guardian who makes sure good people can live safely, that mission never changes. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like David Santos? Someone who found a way to keep serving after their official service ended? Someone who used their skills and experience to make their community safer, stronger, better? Share their story in the comments. Tell us how they continued their mission in civilian life. Because here at the Human Stories, we know that the most important service often happens in places where no one expects to find heroes. Sometimes they're behind coffee counters, sometimes they're driving school buses, sometimes they're working night shifts or managing small businesses, but they're always there, still serving, still protecting, still making sure that the communities they love remain safe and strong. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with others. Help us honor the quiet guardians who never stopped serving, even after they came home. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, If you ever meet a coffee shop owner who seems to know a little too much about keeping people safe, who positions himself strategically behind the counter, who treats every customer like family worth protecting, take a second look. You might be in the presence of someone who once wore a different uniform in service to the same mission, making sure good people can live their lives without fear. The mission continues. It just smells like coffee now.